Hello, good day, everyone. Thank you so much for being with me over Zoom today. I know this has sort of been a weird year, but we are really thrilled to be able to open a new exhibit this winter. It opened on January 16th. That was the official open community day for it. And it will run through April 11th. That'll be the last Sunday to be able to see it. And so I know that we are not doing group tours at this time. However, I definitely wanted to give you all a chance to see a little bit more about what we have on view, get a little bit more details about the exhibit, about some of the individual works that we have on display, and also encourage you, if you feel comfortable doing so, to visit the galleries in person, perhaps maybe during a weekday when it's typically not as busy in the gallery spaces. So a little bit about this exhibition. These artworks are not from our permanent collection. There are over 60 artworks. There's about 67 in total. And 64 of these come from the Reading Public Museum's permanent collection. They have over something crazy, over like 10,000 prints that they have in their whole collection. And while many of these are by James Abbott McNeill Whistler, the American expatriate artist at the turn of the 20th century, there are many others by some of additional contemporaries of his time, or those that he personally knew on occasion, or people who were influenced by him from the Reading Public Museum's collection. To supplement this exhibit, I also thought it might be nice to tie in some additional pieces by Whistler. So two additional works in the exhibition at the Hermitage are from the Chrysler Museum collection by James Whistler, and then one from the Chrysler Museum collection by Frank Duveneck. So there are three loans to us from the Chrysler Museum, but everything else is from the Reading Public Museum's permanent collection. The exhibition is titled Whistler and Company, The Etching Revival, and it uses the central figure of James Abbott McNeill Whistler as the anchor for the entire show. Although there, as you'll see when you actually see the exhibit, there are a whole host of additional artists that are the prints by them are really wonderful and really special. From this intro image here, this is just a shot that I took of the long gallery, which leads to the back staff offices. This just kind of shows the intimate scale for most of the prints that we have on view, and they are small, which is a really nice opportunity to get close to them. And so if you go to the museum and you see them in person, which I do highly encourage, there's just a lot of detail to get absorbed into. And so we have complimentary magnifying glasses at the front desk, which are being sanitized after guests use them. But it allows you to get a little bit closer to the prints because there's just so many details to absorb and so many little quirky little details that you might not want to miss. So I highly encourage you to use that if you see them in person. I also want to mention that for the sake of exhibit design, we opted to just put the artist, title, date, kind of the basic boilerplate information on the object labels by each print, simply because a lot of the text was very long, very lengthy for each individual artwork that came from us from the Reading Public Museum's exhibition design packet. So what we opted to do, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it from this photograph, but on the benches that are located in each of the three upstairs galleries, we have the packet of information that accompanies each piece. So that the content, the didactic for each piece. So I highly encourage you to use that as well if you'd like a little bit more information about each of the pieces that you are seeing. And I'm going to take myself off the screen here just so you can kind of focus on the presentation that I'm going to have. It's just slides really, but I did want to focus on some of the pieces primarily by Whistler, and then also tie in a few others by additional artists that I think might be enjoyable to you all. So without further ado, I will start here. So the exhibition sort of begins in this long gallery, and it's really an assemblage of types of prints that you are going to see, whether it be the genre scene, whether it be portraits. There's a lot of landscapes in in this exhibition too, which is, I feel like a lot of fun. I mean, I haven't gone anywhere in God knows how long at this point, because of the pandemic, and I know most of you are the same way. So for me, as we were unwrapping a lot of these, it really felt as if I had been to these places. So that gave me a little bit of a sense of comfort personally, and I hope that it's something that you feel when you see these prints, and I really hope it's something that our visitors come away feeling that sense of comfort of having traveled to far off places that they might have had on their bucket lists. So this is sort of the beginning gallery, and I titled this one "The Art of Etching." It's sort of an introduction to the exhibition. And it features artworks by, there's one by Whistler that kind of anchors this room. There are others by James McNeill, Otto Henry Bacher, um, Mortimer Luddington Mempes, who was a friend of Whistler until things soured in their relationship. So it just a kind of a collection of different types of scenes that you might expect to see in the rest of the exhibition. And I wanted to start off by just kind of sinking a little bit into the art of James McNeill Whistler. I think when we think about Whistler, we perhaps immediately go to his painted works. I think we're maybe more familiar with his painted works. And as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, this is Nocturne in Black and Gold, or also known as The Falling Rocket. And then we also have on the right-hand side, perhaps his most famous piece. And if you've watched the Mr. Bean movie, it makes a featured appearance in the Mr. Bean movie. This is Arrangement in Gray and Black, #1, but it's also probably more well known as Whistler's Mother. And for those who are familiar with Whistler, he was a leader of the aesthetic movement. So he was heavily inspired by a lot of different artistic influences that were circulating during his age and time. There was a little bit of realism, a little bit of neoclassicism imbued into his work, but eventually he became a proponent of the philosophy art for art's sake, meaning artwork did not necessarily have to have some sort of moral connotation to it, and really it becomes more so that the subject matter is kind of secondary to what he wants to paint. What he's after is creating these visual compositions through color, and so there's a lot of atmospheric feeling and emotion that he uses with the combination of colors. The way that he's working with the different colors as well, you know, different grays, for instance, and then anchoring it by a black figure over here, cloaked in mostly all black clothing. It becomes more about the formal qualities and the formal properties of the painting being a painting first and foremost, and how that visually translates and evokes emotions. And it's purely aesthetic and its purpose. And again, you know, this is his title. His title is Arrangement in Gray and Black. The secondary title is Whistler's Mother. The secondary emphasis is certainly on the sitter. And so I mentioned this just to point out that we are perhaps more familiar with his painted artworks, but that's why this exhibition in particular was so intriguing to bring to the Hermitage, because I think the art world, the printmaking world especially, is one that we haven't focused on so much. Certainly back in 2012 or 2013, we had a woodblock print exhibition featuring Japanese prints, which was really popular, really well received, but we haven't really focused on this etching revival movement. And so with Whistler at the forefront of this movement, I felt that it was a really good way to bring a little bit of Whistler to our galleries. There are also a few artists in our collection where it has been noted that they were influenced by Whistler. Not that they were necessarily knew or met him, but they were influenced by his work. And so just to name a few, Jean-Jacques Tissot actually met Whistler when he was working in the Louvre. He was doing, doing some drawing sketches of famous masterpieces from the Louvre collection, and apparently ran into Whistler on the way and remained somewhat inspired by him, and Whistler, vice versa, inspired by Tissot. Another artist in our collection who has noted that she was influenced by Whistler is surprisingly Helen Turner. she was not necessarily of the philosophy of the formal compositions being the primary source of inspiration for her, but she was really interested in the way that his colors and arrangements created this aestheticism. Um, and so she has noted in personal correspondences and letters that Whistler was of interest and influence to her in her lifetime. The third artist is Charles W. Hawthorne, who was a noted artist at the National Academy of Design, but then also a really influential arts educator throughout his lifetime. And he was also very interested in using color in a sort of similar way to evoke an emotion, create these almost color fields that were just really ahead of his time. So there are just a number of artists in our collection who can be loosely connected to the legacy of Whistler. So that's another reason why I thought this might be a good exhibition to bring in. But enough with that. Let's dive into the world of printmaking. Again, etching is one of those processes in printmaking that I think it seems a little bit like magic or wizardry, just because there's so much that goes on behind the scenes, and what you see as the final output is not always readily apparent, you know, what all has gone into it. So just a little basic overview of printmaking. And this is a whole world that can go in depth. So I'm just going to do a basic overview of printmaking and etching, but I do have additional supplementary information to send you all along with this presentation if you're interested, for instance, in looking at some YouTube videos that show the different process methods of some of these different printmaking methods. And there's also a couple of online links that I'm going to send you as well. So plenty of information coming if depending on how into the printmaking you would like to read up on. But technology for printmaking was established in Europe in the mid 15th century. It was really with the Gutenberg press that it really started to take off. And it was in the German city of Mainz around 1435 and 1455. They're not quite sure exactly when, but within that range. It was Johannes Gutenberg who discovered a process for casting individual letter forms. And so now this technology was available in the West. And the benefit of this was that identical copies of written works could actually be reproduced over again and over again. So this was a huge technological innovation. In 1455, Gutenberg published the first major work, which was the 42-line Bible. And so this was the first substantial book to be published from movable type in Europe. And meanwhile, the printing presses were churning out a wide variety of books throughout Europe, and many were illustrated. And so the primary benefit of printmaking was really realized through its benefit of making printed material available in the form and illustrations as well in the form of books or later even magazines and any printed material. So just kind of an overview of some of the primary printmaking processes. They can be grouped into 5 methods. So the first set of methods refers to a relief-based process, and that corresponds to the image above. Things like a woodcut or for Japanese works on paper, wood block. There's also the lino cut. And so this is, you know, if you've done like a rubber stamp process before where you groove out some of the areas of maybe a rubber stamp, you are left with these raised lines. And it's the raised lines where you register your ink and then you lay your paper on flat. So this is what we refer to as the relief-based process. And so woodcut or wood block and lino cut are great examples of these. Now the other method is called intaglio. And the intaglio process refers to the reverse of that relief-based process. So as opposed to having the ink charged on the raised portion, the ink actually goes into the depressed grooves here. And you can use, there's different materials that you can actually use for your plate. You can still use wood, but I think the more common plate type to use is metal, specifically copper for etching. And so you're registering the ink into the plate, but it's actually getting pressed into the cut grooves, as you'll see here. And as you're wiping the metal plate, you're making sure that the ink actually goes into the grooves however you want it to go. And then you press the paper on it. And when it's pressed through, it's dampened paper. So as it's pressed through, it'll pick up the ink and absorb it onto the paper wherever it's supposed to go. So a couple of the intaglio-based processes are etching, also engraving, dry point, aquatint, mezzotint. And then there are other methods of printmaking, such as lithography, silkscreen, monotype. Again, I'm not going to go into these too much just because the primary focus of this exhibition is etching. But I just mentioned this to point out that there is often a combination of etching and dry point used for several of these prints. There's also one lithograph by James McNeill Whistler on view. And so it's not as if artists are restricted to using one technique over another. Um, there's a lot of flexibility within the printmaking process because there are so many steps involved and so many tools and so many materials that you can use that it really is a limitless world of possibilities for artists. And that's one thing that I think this exhibition it sort of underscores is the limitless possibility of printmaking techniques, especially for artists of this time. So etching, as I mentioned before, is an intaglio-based process. What distinguishes this one from the others is that it uses acid, and it can also use a ground, a waxed ground. So this is usually a combination of beeswax and asphaltum that's been heated onto the metal plate, and this just acts as a resist so that the ink goes where you want it to go. Or I'm sorry, the acid goes where you need it to go. And so the process of the acid eating away the metal is really the basic principle of etching as opposed to some of the other printmaking methods. And then depending on how you're varying whatever ground, that wax ground you're putting on the plate will yield darker or crisper lines or the soft pencil-like or chalk-like marks that you see. So really just a variety of different styles and expressions can be facilitated through this process. In etching, the cutting is done by the acid, and the artist can also draw freely on the wax-covered copper plate. And so intaglio can be identified by the shape of the lines, but I'm not going to get in too much to that, simply because even though you might be familiar with printmaking techniques, I've had several people that have seen the exhibition say, I've made prints before, but it's still, one struggles to figure out exactly what the differentiating lines are, how you can be able to identify what printmaking process has been used depending on the different lines. So it's very it takes a good eye and it takes a lot of experience, I think, in seeing the different types of printed lines. So I'm not going to get into that too much. So let's talk a little bit about the etching revival as a movement. So for centuries, prints were primarily used in books. And it wasn't really until the Dutch master Rembrandt van Rijn, who was considered the first artist in the Western tradition to start using printmaking, specifically etching, as an artistic medium, that things started to move in terms of artists picking up printmaking techniques and using it for artistic methods. So Rembrandt is really considered the father of this etching revival movement. But again, he was, in the 1600s. So nothing had really been advanced or done for several years until about the 19th century. So over the course of the 19th century, etching had been relatively lessened in popularity by the advent of some of the other more cost-effective processes, such as lithography. But by the middle of the century, artists in Europe and even later in America advocated for an etching revival. And this was really done to counter the primarily commercial associations that printmaking had garnered. As I mentioned, for centuries, prints were primarily used in books for including illustrations in books or in printed media. And so there's a profit-based fundamental core to the use and innovation of this technology. And it was seen primarily as a technology, not necessarily as a tool for art making. And so by the 19th century, that starts to change. In France, the etching revival was led by an artist named Charles Meyron, and there's actually one print by him in the exhibition. And he was mostly known for his haunting views of Paris from about the 1850s. And at the end of the century, many French impressionists turned to printmaking as they had been immensely inspired as well by Japanese woodblock prints. Some post-impressionists also turned to woodblock or woodcut because the medium originated in this sort of pre-industrial context, and they felt that it was more in keeping with the artist's hand. It didn't have that commercialization association to it. And this was sort of a reaction, of course, to industrialism that was also playing a major influence in lives at the time. And so American expatriate James McNeill Whistler was one of the leading artists of his age and day who was active in the Etching Revival movement. Of course, he was an expatriate. He was born in America, but lived most of his life in London. And so again, the show is anchored by him, but there are other leaders of the Etching Revival movement who are also featured in the exhibition. So what comes of the Etching Revival movement? Well, since the 19th century, the art world witnessed an explosion of the production of prints. And prints can exist in multiple numbers, limited editions. There's a wide variety of things that you can do with prints. And prints were less expensive than unique paintings. However, by retaining the control, this is one thing that Whistler really did, was he retained control over the printing process as well. So he could control, how many editions that he were churning out of his plates, and he could control, whether he's getting a commission from the London Society or, he's able to control the distribution of his prints as well. So he's very much interested in retaining that artistic control, that intellectual control of his artistic property. And the Etching Revival as a whole refers to this renewed interest in printmaking as a medium of art making. So since its invention in the 16th century, innovations in printmaking had not really occurred again since Rembrandt. And in this Northern European tradition, artists of the Victorian period found benefits to printmaking. Of course, it was low cost. It required few resources. I mean, some of the resources that you could find would be things that you'd have laying around in your home. But of course, you did have to have access to a printing press. Additionally, copies could be made very easily, and your work could be secured for a number of different print media companies, such as magazines, newspapers, and illustrated publications. So this was a way for artists to make income, and it was also a way for them to have artistic control over their intellectual property. So let's take a look at Whistler as he's sort of the anchor of the Etching Revival in this exhibition. Whistler was born in Massachusetts in 1834. When he was a young boy, his family actually moved to Russia, St. Petersburg, Russia, for his father's job. I didn't know this before I brought the show in, but as I was looking into his life a little further, his father was actually a railroad engineer, which is pretty interesting. And his father dies, but well, technical difficulties. Let me restart my presentation, of course. Let's see here. As long as it's still recording. Yeah, okay. So let's restart that. My apologies. Let's go through some of the slides we've already gone through. Okay, sorry about that. So after his father's death, the family does move back to the States, but Whistler, at this point in his life, he's approaching like the late teens, early adulthood. He begins to figure out what he wants to do in life. So his mother wanted him to try out the priesthood, and that obviously didn't pan out for him. And then he tried, going to the U.S. Military Academy in New York, in West Point. So he was also not cut out for the military. However, while he was there, he did learn drafting. He was in the drafting department, and they made maps. And so it was there that he was getting this training in basic printmaking as a tool, as a technology for map making. And, the military academy didn't pan out. So he decided he wanted to become an artist. So he moves to Paris to study. But he also then moves to London, and which is where his half sister lived with her husband and children. So his sister's husband was actually a surgeon, a very well respected surgeon. But he was an art collector, particularly of old master prints by Rembrandt. And he was also an avid etcher himself. He was actually one of the leaders of the Etching Revival movement in England. And his name was Francis Seymour Hayden. And of course, he then had a major impact on Whistler in his early years as Whistler was working as an artist in London. Unfortunately, and this seems to unfortunately be the case with many of Whistler's relationships and friendships, their relationship soured by the late 1850s over some dispute, and they apparently never spoke again after their falling out. However, it's important to note that the connection that they had in at least his early years, early 1850s, while he was living in London, because again, not only was Seymour Hayden, a leader of the Etching Revival movement in England, but he also would have given access to Whistler to some of these masterpiece prints by Rembrandt. So one of the first artworks on view in that long gallery is this work. It's called The Forge. This is by Whistler in about 1861. And it shows just a variety of the line work, really interesting line work that we see in this particular print. And the text label on this one focuses more so on his fascination with forges and blacksmiths as a recurring theme in Whistler's work, particularly during this period. And in this case, this is actually done with the set of prints that he was commissioned to do, the London set or the Thames set. And so he really had this fascination with forges and blacksmiths. But here you can see just the variety of different line work, the way he's working with the level of ink registered onto the plate, maybe not wiping off the plate clean afterwards. So you really get this kind of atmospheric effect in the background. And I love how the figures are rendered here. You just get the essential details of the figures, the essential details of the gestures, but whatever is not as important to capturing that essence is kind of secondary. So you see, oh, look at how wonderful this line work is here, just kind of capturing the fact that she's sort of in the background, but she's a presence. So you get the visual clue that she's a presence, but all the details just sort of fade away. So it's a really lovely work in that long gallery to kind of start us thinking about James McNeill Whistler as a leader of this Etching Revival movement. Now in the hallway space leading to the back galleries, there are 5 portraits that are on view, and all of these are by Whistler. So I've just picked out a couple that I wanted to mention in this presentation. So this is Annie seated. So this is actually the daughter of Whistler's half-sister and her husband, Seymour Hayden. She's about 9 or 10 when she's been recorded by Whistler, and there are different variations of her. She is a subject for Whistler on many occasions. And this is one of his earliest figure studies of children. And as you see from the text label, others include just Annie, little Arthur, and Seymour standing, all from about the 1850s. Another really wonderful portrait that's on view in the hallway space leading to the back 2 galleries is this one. This is a portrait of actually a musician. His name is Juste, I hope I'm saying that right, Beckett. He was a sculptor, and he was also a musician. So the work is also known as the fiddler, despite the fact that the instrument that this figure actually played was a cello. It's also known as the fiddler. So this work, you just see a lot of that atmospheric quality. You could even tie it to some of the nocturne paintings, that atmospheric quality that you see with the toning of the ink here. It's just really lovely done, really wonderfully done. And you'll see again, kind of in the same tradition as that artwork of the forge that we saw prior to this, a lot of attention paid to the facial features and the elements that capture us and capture the essence of the sitter. But again, whatever is on, secondary to that essence just sort of melds away into the background. So it's a really wonderful example of that atmospheric quality that Whistler was achieving not only with his oils, but also through his printmaking. And this again is part of the artist's Thames set, about 1859. So the middle gallery focuses on, this exhibition is arranged for the most part regionally. And so the middle gallery is home to artworks that depict scenes of England, and then there's also a few scenes of Scotland. And so this is just kind of an open gallery shot of that. The artwork on the right is from the Reading Public Museum's collection, but the two on the left are two of the works by Whistler that are loaned to us from the Chrysler Museum's collection. And let me just make sure I'm up to date here. And so each gallery has this panel, so I'm gonna just go ahead and read that. So you're not trying to strain to see what that says. James McNeill Whistler spent decades living in England, where he produced drawings, etchings, and lithographs of the commercial docks and warehouses along the Thames. Quaint storefronts in Chelsea, views of the idyllic English countryside, and remarkable portraits of friends and family. Whistler embraced the modern industrial complex and recorded the bustling docks, wharfs, ships, and barges in London's East End. His etchings evoke the gritty ambiance of the river's dockland before the radical reconstruction of the 1870s as part of the embankment project. Whistler's brother-in-law, again, Seymour F. Hayden, was an avid collector of etchings by Rembrandt and other old masters. He was also a skilled etcher in his own right. Hayden advocated tirelessly for the art of etching, became president of the Royal Society of Painter Etchers, established in 1880. London became a hub of the Etching Revival, attracting artists from France, Scotland, and the United States. These artists experimented in innovative ways, influencing a whole generation of artists who ensured the prominence of etching into the first decades of the 20th century. So just to kind of zoom in on that back wall there, this is the one from the Reading Public Museum's collection. This is called Billingsgate. And this view of the Thames shows Billingsgate Market, England's largest inland fish market on the north bank of the river at the north end of London Bridge, which can actually be seen in the background here. You see the little tower right over here. The plate may have been etched outdoors, which is interesting. So he's doing these preliminary drawings for the plates on plein air. And this was a technique that Hayden, his brother-in-law, advocated for. Again, he was a leader of the Etching Revival movement in England. He was an avid etcher himself, and he was one to go outside and actually prepare his plates on plein air. So Whistler kind of picking up that tradition from him. The etching was printed as part of a series of 16 etchings of scenes on the Thames and other subjects, also known as the Thames set, which was published in 1871. It's a heavily inked impression. The back gallery is home to a lot of additional prints. Just because of spatial limitations, we tended to group these. Each wall basically represents a geographic region. So this back wall here is areas, depictions of France. And just to kind of give an introduction to the Etching Revival in France, it was influenced in part by the Dutch Golden Age painter etcher, Rembrandt, and the realist painter, Gustave Courbet. The Etching Revival emerged in France in the middle of the 19th century. And again, it was led by Charles Mayran. Central to these scenes that you might find in the etchings are scenes of everyday life or genre scenes, portraits of laborers, and picturesque landscapes that become the subjects of a growing group of artists. During this time, Whistler also completed the French set, where he created impressions for leading French etchers such as Alphonse Legros, Charles-François d'Aubigny, and again, Charles Meyron, among many others. Periodicals like the Gazette des Beaux-Arts and the Aux Fortes Moderne, published by Alfred Cadar, sparked the general public's interest in etching. There was also the Society of Etchers, which was founded in 1862 in France, which became the first etching association in France. Paris then became a center of printmaking in the city's historic structures, the Seine, the grand boulevards, the lush parks that were depicted in these etchings, and artists really focused on the city's transformation under the Haussmannization project, whereby the medieval core had been modernized and redesigned by the 1850s. This work over here, although it is small, I highly encourage you to see it in person if you can, or to search the Reading Public Museum's online collection. If you search Charles Meyron, this print will come up. It's a lovely little print. It shows Notre Dame in the background. And so it's just a really beautiful landscape and kind of cityscape view. This is a really beautiful one as well. There's just so many beautiful little gems here. Again, you can kind of imagine how when you're up close to these would really make you feel as if you're traveling to France, or if you've been to these places already, maybe it helps you recall those memories in your head and makes you live through them a little bit, which is really nice. The next artwork I'm going to focus on, there are two on this wall that are by Whistler, and it's these two vertical format works. So I'm going to move on to the next slide and kind of go through that one a little bit. This is called Le Vieux à Loquet, and I am really sorry if I'm butchering the French on that. The English translation is Old Rag Woman, or the Old Rag Seller. So she's actually sorting rags. And it's a combination of almost like a genre scene, but also he had a interesting fascination with doorways. And so for some of these, it's thought that he created the doorways first and then included the figures afterwards. The composition of this was created at the beginning of Whistler's preoccupation with these doorways, and it's likely that the work was etched in Paris, but it was published as part of that French set, or the 12 etchings from nature in 1858. The composition points to the beginning of Whistler's preoccupation with facades and doorways, and with a motif of a female figure silhouetted in a doorway against a darkened interior. It's likely that this work was etched in Paris and then published. And recalling, his famous painting of Whistler's mother, this one, it's been noted before, so this is an original idea, but it's been noted before that this is sort of the beginnings of that formula he's coming up with of placing the female sitter in doorways like that. But then it also could also be connected to the composition that he chooses for arrangement in gray and black #1, also known as Whistler's Mother. There are striking similarities, I feel, between the composition of this work and that painting, which was done 17 or 18 years later after this. This was 1858, and arrangement in gray and black was done in 1871. Now to turn to one of the additional French scenes. Oh, it's going to do that again. Okay. Very sorry about that. Wouldn't be a Zoom presentation without a few technical hiccups. Scroll through. Well, and you can see this is arrangement in gray and black #1. Again, kind of recalls the similar composition, and sitter with the bonnet and the dark clothing. Okay, so the next one from the French wall is a work of Souvenir de Saint-Denis. This is done by Auguste Louis Lepere. And Lepere was also an undisputed leader in the Etching Revival, which is why I wanted to mention this one. He became known as the prime graphic artist of scenes from everyday life. And he also experimented with innovative techniques such as combining etching wood engraving within the same print. And again, this is something that you'll see if you look at the details of each of the object labels, you'll see that sometimes there's a combination of etching with dry point or lithography or engraving. So it's not as if each artist is constricted to one particular printmaking method. There's a lot of exploration. So by the 1870s, he clearly emerged as one of the most renowned printmakers of his time. And again, the addition of using these different printmaking methods is really what set him apart. But as you can tell from this one, there are so many little details of life in this city that you almost have to use a magnifying glass to get close to it. But I love how you just get this juxtaposition of what look like people kind of resting on a hillside, almost sort of that country life. But then in the background, you have the smokestacks and you see the grit and grime of the city in the background. So it's almost like this nostalgia for the lost purity and beauty of the natural world being lost to make way for industrialization in the background. Now in Italy, and more specifically Venice, this had been a tourist spot, and it still is today. Venice is wonderful. Venice attracted artists for centuries, and it was during the Etching Revival that Whistler, accompanied by Duveneck, Joseph Pennell, and others, they created etchings that depicted the city's romantic canals, Gothic structures, and bustling urban life. Whistler created 2 separate portfolios of etchings of Venice, which were derived from this trip to the city between 1879 and 1880. He was actually commissioned by the Fine Arts Society in London to do this. And he was supposed to stay for just like a number of months, but he ended up extending his stay there to 14 months. You know, just kind of taking in the city. I don't blame him. So the Venice set is a portfolio that includes 12 etchings that were commissioned by the Fine Arts Society in London and were exhibited in the 1880s. So of Whistler's depictions, you see the ordinary, sometimes shabby quarters of Venice that became some of the artist's most popular and enduring images. Whistler served as a teacher and a mentor to a group of artists who were living in the Casa Jankowitz, which was a gathering place for artists. And interestingly, this group included the American painter etcher, Frank Duveneck, who, along with his students, called themselves the Duveneck Boys. And this included artists such as Otto Henry Bucker, among others. And Frank Duveneck was born in Covington, Kentucky. So he is considered a Cincinnati artist. And so he is of particular interest to me. The Cincinnati Art Museum, which is in Cincinnati, they have, I believe someone said, over 250 works just by Frank Duveneck throughout his lifetime. And part of that has to do with the fact that he was not only born in Covington, Kentucky, but after his time in Europe where he was teaching and training, he actually came back to Cincinnati, and he was a leader, an arts educator of the Cincinnati Art Academy. And so he had a profound influence on many artists after him. So a younger generation of artists absorbed the master's style, adopting his preference for humble, less touristy sites throughout the city of canals. And I'm really sorry I didn't take a wall picture of the Italy wall. So that's a little bit of a teaser, I guess, to get you to go see them in person. One of the artworks by Whistler from this Italy wall is this work, the Riva #1, from the series, the first Venice set, which was done from 1879 to 1880. This is an elevated viewpoint of the Ria degli Schiavone, probably from his room in the Casa Jankowitz in Venice, and part of the commission that he received from the Fine Arts Society of London. The traditional method of showing detail in the foreground is actually flouted. And instead, he presents this triangular composition, which is people populated by fishermen, groups of people engaged in conversation, and just the suggestion of stones and pavement. And I love the way that you just get the essential qualities of what's most important in the scene or what stands out in the scene to kind of ground the scene. And then all the extraneous details just kind of melt away into the foreground, which I really love this work. Another really beautiful and personal favorite depiction of the Venice wall is this Sotto Portico del Traghetto by George Edward Hopkins. He was also a student of Duveneck. And in this Venetian view, Hopkins just absorbs the old master's approach to etching and relates very compositionally closely to Whistler's Venice set and even his second set. So Hopkins studied at the Cincinnati Art School. He also later attended the Royal Academy in Munich, which is presumably how he knew Duveneck, and he became mixed in with all these other American painters who were studying under Frank Duveneck while he was teaching in Munich. And in Venice that same year, he formed a friendship with the author Henry James and Whistler. And so these connections certainly influenced him in his lifetime. But this is just one of my favorite depictions of the Venice scene. It really just captures the romance. You have the foreground details, but I love the way that the artist has rendered that sense of light. It's a print, so it's really difficult to capture the Italian light through a print, but he's done that through a little bit of toning and a little bit of shading, some cross hatching. So you get the sense that this is sort of a canal that's been sunlit, but there's also a lot of shade to it. So it's just a really romantic and very peaceful, very tranquil. And it looks like the gondola is just ready for you to hop into, and the gondolier over here. So for me, it just recalls a lot of beautiful memories and travel memories of Venice. The last two walls in the back gallery are dedicated to the Americas. And again, the Etching Revival started in Europe, predominantly in England and France. And then, of course, artists were inspired by their stays in Italy, but it manifested a little bit differently in the Americas, simply because in the early half of the 19th century, there were few skilled printmakers in America. And those who, oh my goodness. Okay. I'm going to pause right here a moment. Go back to this. It's because this program is taking up so much memory while we're doing the presentation at the same time. So I do apologize. But we just have a few more slides to get through. So the Etching Revival in America manifests itself in a little bit different way. Because there were few skilled printmakers in America, it was primarily relegated to business interests. So focusing more so on the commercially viable ventures, things like illustrations for newspapers, books and magazines, engravings of famous history paintings that were reproduced in printed material. And although there were few printers, by the final decades of the century, many printmakers turned toward what's considered a mainstay of American visual art, and that is landscapes. There was a whole Western part of America that was a tremendous source of inspiration for a lot of painters and even etchers. And so to capture that beauty of the West was really inspiring at this time. Moreover, the New York Etching Club established itself in 1877, and it influenced the popularity of the Etching Revival in the United States, and it was the main professional etching organization in the country. So it was it took a little bit longer for the Etching Revival to catch on in America, and a lot of it had to do with just the associations of etching with this commercial world. But it was really the expatriate American pioneers of etching, such as James McNeill Whistler, or hey, how about Mary Cassatt? And they eventually were joined in their successes by contemporaries and later generations of artists back in the States, including Frank Duveneck, Otto Henry Bacher, Joseph Pennell, who interestingly was actually Whistler's biographer, Earl Horder, John Taylor Arms, and Henry Farrer. So I'm going to show you a couple of my favorite prints from this America section of the exhibition, if it will let me proceed to the next slide. Here we go. This work is by Henry Farrer. So he's actually English born, but he immigrated to America. And at first I was drawn to this image, before we actually received the exhibition, we just had a checklist of thumbnail images. And right off the get-go, I was really drawn to this piece because it just reminded me so much of 17th century Dutch Golden Age paintings, which is also, I don't know if many of you know that, but it's also one of my loves. But seeing it in person was just remarkable. And I'll explain why in a moment. This is typical of Farrer's harbor views from this time period, and it really demonstrates the artist's ability to show the deepening shadows of evening as it approaches. So again, there's a really beautiful tonal quality to it, atmospheric quality to it. You'll notice that the marked lines in the sky that kind of evoke that very romantic cloudiness are not the same type of lines that evoke the reflective quality of the water. So that takes a special skill in itself. What I love about this work the most, aside from the beautiful composition and the way it's arranged, it's just beautifully balanced. But it's also printed onto satin as opposed to traditional paper. So this picture does not do this work justice by any means. You have to see it in person. You have to see the way that the light reflects off of um, the fabric surface. It's just a gorgeous piece, and it creates such a luxurious quality to it. And so it's not necessarily a novelty to print on fabric, although it's certainly an unusual practice, and it would have required great skill. There probably would have been several failed attempts along the way. But it's an interesting cornerstone piece because it recalls the centuries long tradition of printing on textiles, block printing on textiles for centuries. And it also is sort of a precursor to what becomes serigraphs or silk screen prints. So again, continuing that tradition into the contemporary, and the silk screening, really takes off with the commercialization of graphic arts in like the 60s and 70s, especially. So it's really an interesting cornerstone piece, and I really love it for that reason. It also has a gorgeous quality to it. The print quality is gorgeous on it. The composition is beautifully balanced as well. Speaking of beautifully balanced compositions, this is another favorite from the America wall. This is the Valley of the Savory from Wyoming, 1934. So this exhibition goes from the 1850s all the way through the 1930s, which I think is really remarkable as well. This is by an artist, John Taylor Arms. Arms began his career as an architect, so you can imagine there's a lot of very tedious detail that an architect needs to capture. And so he's known for a very meticulous, almost obsessively precise etching style. And he had worked with documenting Gothic cathedrals of Europe. But here we see a little bit more modern and even experimental approach, and also an emphasis on abstracted forms. So we see that much of the plate is occupied by, of course, I'm going to pause here to see what the computer is doing. And if it doesn't come back, that is okay. That is that is actually the last slide in the presentation anyway. But I really love the way that work in particular, it focused so much on the meticulous detail and capturing the beauty and kind of the rolling hills of the scenery, but then you have that gorgeous amount of white space or negative space that beautifully balance the composition. So that is a little bit of a quite lengthy introduction, actually, to the Etching Revival and Whistler and Company, the Etching Revival exhibition, which is going on now at the Hermitage Museum. So again, I hope if you feel comfortable doing so, you will come in and visit the gallery spaces yourself. Again, I do recommend a weekend day as opposed to a weekday as opposed to a weekend day, just because we typically don't get an influx of visitors during the weekday compared to the weekend days when everybody's off work and able to visit places. So if you do come, I hope this has been helpful. I hope this has been a good introduction for you all. Again, I will send out more information to you, and don't feel like you have to read everything. Again, we are not conducting group tours. But I just for the sake of really getting to enjoy the exhibition a little bit more, and being able to enjoy what we have on right now, and being in the loop on things, just wanted to provide a little introduction. And you are free to explore the world of etching or the world of printmaking at your own leisure with some of the additional materials that I will be sharing with you. And so I really appreciate you all tuning in. I am sorry if this ended up being much longer than initially planned, as is usually the case with me. But I hope you all are very well, staying healthy, and I really appreciate all of your encouragement and support along the way. And I desperately look forward to the time when we can see each other in person again. Thank you all so much, and I hope to see you soon.